Kim by Rudyard Kipling, book review. So before I get into the meat of this book review, I want to talk a little bit about how this book ended up on my reading list to begin with. There are three reasons. One, I had recently finished reading the biography of Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton by Edward Rice. I've also reviewed that book on this channel. And in that book, Rice claims that Kipling based one of the characters in Kim off of Richard Burton. Unfortunately, I left my copy of that book in Japan, so I can't say with absolute certainty, but I believe it was the character of Colonel Crichton in Kim. So having just finished that biography of Richard Burton and being interested about the man, I thought it would be a nice follow-up to pick up Kim and read about a literary portrait of Richard Burton. The second reason is also related to the first. While I was reading Richard Burton's biography, I learned for the first time about something called the Great Game. The Great Game was something that had been completely left out of my history education in school, but it was the 19th century rivalry between Britain and Russia for influence and control of Afghanistan, played out by secret agents from both sides trying to obtain information and influence Afghanistan warlords. Now, the idea of a 19th century version of the Cold War, of Cold War spy games, is intriguing enough on its own for those of us who just like interesting history for history's sake. But the fact that our own army, the United States Army, is currently stuck in the Afghanistan quagmire makes this historical period all the more relevant. It turns out that the whole plot of the book Kim revolves around the Great Game and tells the story of a young boy who gets sucked into the world of 19th century espionage in Central Asia. And in fact, this depends a little bit on who you read, but some people say that the Great Game, like the phrase, the Great Game, started in the novel Kim, and then was used by other writers to refer to the spying between Britain and Russia and Afghanistan. Other people say that it was first coined by somebody else, but the term became popular because of the novel Kim. But at any rate, the novel Kim has something to do with the phrase, the Great Game, entering the popular imagination. Third reason I wanted to read this book, and the final reason, is that Rudyard Kipling was an author I enjoyed in childhood, and I've always been meaning to return to him. I read The Jungle Book when, I don't remember exactly, I think it was about 6th grade, and I really liked it. I remember actually, because it was an old 19th century classic, approaching it with a bit of trepidation, as you do at that age with old books, right? I was like, it's such an old book, this is probably going to be difficult to read. And then starting with page 1 and just being completely charmed with how easy and pleasant it was to read. Loved The Jungle Book. Actually, there are 2 Jungle Books. The edition I had was called The Jungle Books and included both books in one binding. I also read the Just So stories. Those didn't make as big of an impression on me. They were just kind of stories that were around the house, so I read them. But I found them entertaining enough. I don't know if it's fair to count movies, but Gunga Din, which was based off of one of Kipling's poems, was a 1939 movie about British soldiers battling Thuggees in India. I saw it one night when it was on TV, on cable, when I was young, and I actually really liked that movie. Now, Gunga Din, filmed in 1939, was politically incorrect long before I saw it. But when you're a kid watching movies in the basement on the TV, nobody tells you these things. So it shaped my childhood image of India. as gallant British soldiers advancing the cause of civilization against the savage native thuggies. Which brings me to the dark side of Kipling's legacy, the whole white man's burden thing. Something I was blissfully ignorant of as a child when I read the Jungle Books. I had no idea Kipling was such a problematic writer when I was 12. But it's something that strikes me as inescapable now as an adult reading Kipling. I'm going to try and dodge this controversy as much as I can by just saying up front that I'm no expert. A few years ago, I did read an essay on Kipling by George Orwell when leafing through a book of George Orwell's essays. The entire essay is online. I'll link to it down below. But if you can't be bothered to read the whole thing, I'll summarize Orwell's thoughts. This is me paraphrasing Orwell. He says, "I know it's popular in leftist circles these days to call Kipling a fascist, but that's not true. He may be an imperialist, a racist, a sadist, and a bad poet, but he's not a fascist." That's me paraphrasing Orwell, but that's the gist of his essay. And this is the image of Kipling I had as an adult, as, you know, one of the bad guys, the white man's burden guys. Therefore, I was pleasantly surprised in reading this book being Kim, to find that it had a lot more sensitivity to India than I expected, given Kipling's reputation. There are overtones of subtle racism throughout the book, but overall, one gets the sense that from Kipling that he loved India and he loved the people. Which isn't surprising, considering how much of his life he spent in India, and that he was apparently able to speak Hindi before he was able to speak English. Now, the plot of the book Kim is really threefold. It's partly a road trip story, as Kim and a Tibetan Lama search for a mystical river. It's partly a spy story, as Kim is trained in the Great Game and must learn to outwit French and Russian spies. And it's partly a coming-of-age story, as Kim grows from a child into a young man during the course of the book. But even with three plots, all three of these plots are rather thin. Most of the beauty of this book is just in its description of 19th century India. And this is the real value of it. Orwell said of Kipling, in the essay I was just mentioning earlier, Orwell said, quote, "Tawdry and shallow though it is, Kipling's is the only literary picture that we possess of 19th century Anglo-India." End quote. So I don't know if that's true or not. If somebody else can think of another literary portrait of 19th century Anglo-India, let me know. But assuming that's true, that's something, huh? That means that a book like Kim, I mean, we have historical documents from Anglo-India, 19th century Anglo-India, but we don't have any literary descriptions other than Kipling, other than books like Kim. And in Kim, you can see vivid characters, marketplaces, crowded trains, and the landscape descriptions that Kipling includes in this book. You can really visualize 19th century Anglo-India while you're reading this book. It's a fascinating literary portrayal, and if, as Orwell says, it's the only one we have of 19th century Anglo-India, then it's valuable and worth reading. It does also bring me to an important caveat. This book is really heavy on descriptions and pretty light on the actual story. Now, as I mentioned above, I picked this book up in part because I was expecting a spy story. You know, the British spies in Afghanistan and the Russian spies in Afghanistan. And that's in there, but it's not the main point of the book. The main point of the book is just descriptions of India. Once I realized what kind of book I was in for, however, and readjusted my expectations accordingly, then I found it a fascinating read, just enjoying it for what it was. Second caveat, this isn't always an easy book to read. Now, I said before, when I read The Jungle Book as a 12-year-old child, I found that incredibly easy to read. I was therefore expecting Kim would be maybe along the same lines, easy and pleasant to read, but it wasn't. It's often classified as children's literature, but if you look into it, there's a debate about whether or not it's really children's literature, because some of the prose is pretty heavy for a child to wade through. Even as an adult, I found the prose a little bit difficult to wade through. It's a struggle. While I was trying to review this book, I was searching the internet for other bloggers who had already reviewed this book before me, and I found an interesting one. This is from a blog called Blogging the Canon. As the name suggests, he goes through and he reads classic books in the literary canon and then writes reviews of them. And I'll just quote from his description because, excuse me, I think this somewhat echoes my thoughts. Quote, "I find this a curious book. First, as I mentioned previously, I sometimes find it hard to follow. Sometimes there will be a conversation and I'll think, whoa, is it the whiskey or do I just have no idea what these people are trying to say to one another? Then I'll realize I haven't even had any whiskey. And then a page or two later, everything is clear again. Not sure if this is due to Kipling's style or whether it's just ADD kicking in. Regardless, it's disconcerting. Then there's the problem of a lot of vernacular in the book. There are a bunch of different types of people, the white English, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and each of them seem to have their own nickname. Purari, Fakur, Sahib, Pathan, etc. Well, exotic and colorful, it's also hard to follow. An annotated version of this book would be an excellent help. There's also the issue of politics. Just who is spying on who in the great game? We all know Britain ruled India in the 1800s. But who were they spying on? We get some clues, rebellious kings, Russians, but the historical background is unknown to me." End quote. I'll link to his full review in the description down below, and it's an interesting blog worth checking out. But anyways, I agree with much of this. It can be a struggle to comprehend parts of this book or to get through this book. That being said, for me, in the end, the rewards of this book were worth the struggle. That's something every reader will have to decide for themselves. For me, in the end, it was worth it, though. There was enough interesting things in this book to make up for some prose that was at times a little bit difficult. One final note. Edward Said has apparently written extensively on Kim and the subtle themes of imperialism in the book. If you're not familiar with Edward Said, he's a very famous scholar who was famous for writing on the themes of Orientalism. Orientalism in this context meaning how Western writers would stereotype the East when they wrote. So this book, as you can imagine, is right up his alley. I'm sure what he wrote is fascinating. I've not been able to track down his essay. I don't know if it's online somewhere. Somebody send me a link or something. So yeah, all I can really say is I'm sure he did a much better job of analyzing this book than I could. That essay is out there somewhere. I don't know. I'll finish the review here.